Hi class, welcome to lecture 4, part B. So we talked about constructivism, we're talking about social theories of international relations. We talked in part A about constructivism. We're gonna talk about in part B, all about Marxism. Here, of course, is a picture of Karl Marx, and I have in parentheses radicalism, because Marxism very much is a radical political ideology. So here's another picture of Karl Marx in one of his quotes. Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Again, very much a radical philosophy. If you're interested in more information on Karl Marx, here's an interesting video you can watch. We're not going to talk too much about Marx's life, which is why I include this. Not mandatory that you watch it. We're going to more talk about the theory of Marxism. So let's get started on that. So Marxism is, of course, very different from the three international relations theories we've talked about before. And so different, in fact, that its basic unit of analysis is very different than realism, liberalism, and constructivism. You know, when we're talking about these other theories, we're looking at the international system and we're looking at states' relationships with the international system. And different theories have different ways of identifying that, whether the actors affect the system or the system affects the actors, or in the case of constructivism, whether it's the identities of the actors that affect the system. Marxism is more concerned with economic aspects, especially class, capital, and the control of the means of production. So to Marx, he believed that a capitalist economy is essentially based on two antagonistic social classes. And we're talking kind of about domestic politics, but we're going to expand to international in a second. But it's important you understand the basics of kind of this theory. You have the bourgeoisie and you have the proletariat. You have the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production, the bosses, those with money, and the proletariat, those workers whose the only thing they own is their own labor, and they sell that labor to the bourgeoisie to survive. The bourgeoisie then turn that into surplus profit, which they keep. Okay, so it's an antagonistic relationship between the haves and the haves, not the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So he would argue, again, this is antagonistic relationship because the proletariat, the working, the poor, they put more labor into the work that they give to the bourgeoisie and they get back in pay, right? That's surplus, that's profit. So, if you're working in a steel mill, you're making salary or hourly pay, but your output isn't measuring what you're getting back through your money, right? This surplus is taken or stolen, as they might put it, by the bourgeoisie. So there's a misconception in today's world, you see it all over the internet, that capitalism and Marxism are at constant loggerheads. And in some ways that's very true. They're very different ideologies, very different economic practices. But, despite the negativity, Marx himself did believe that capitalism was progress, because he believed in a historical ladder, essentially, right? You need to progress slowly from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism to this stateless society, right? This non-governed society, essentially, this utopian type society. And in some ways, capitalism is necessary, again, because it's progress above feudalism, but also it provides a way for labor to sell itself, which is necessary to instigate a sort of revolution to take us to the next step of socialism, and also because it builds the infrastructure necessary for these future types of ideologies like socialism and ultimately communism, right? You have to have a point where you build that infrastructure so you can survive in the next stage of history. So you might hear the term late stage capitalism, right? Meaning at some point we're going to rise up, overthrow our capitalist tendencies and implement socialism or communism. So I mentioned the socialist revolutions. This will happen when the means of productions are placed under social control for the benefit of the proletariat. So the people will own the means of production. Instead of the bourgeoisie owning production, it will be owned by the people. which, ultimately is the government. The government are the people. And proletariats, the working class, the exploited, as Marx might say, are the vast majority of the population. It's just a matter of mobilizing them into a vanguard of the proletariat to seize the means of productions. Now, when we're talking about Marxism in relationship to other theories of international relations, such as realism and liberalism, it fundamentally disagrees on the conditions of the structure of the international system. And again, we explained this when we talked about the domestic issues of Marxism. Very much like there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, in the international system, you have that same structure. We call these wealthy and poor countries, or core countries are wealthy and periphery countries are poor countries. And just like the bourgeoisie exploit the proletariat, the wealthy core countries are constantly taking advantage of underdeveloped or periphery countries and exploiting them for wealth. The same kind of thing, right? They're exploiting their labor and keeping the surplus profit. Now, how do they do this? Well, peripheral countries tend to be production countries, right? Poor countries, developed countries tend to have some kind of staple, economic staple, whether it be wood, grain, steel, whatever it is. These goods are transferred to a poor country and sold, and the profit is kept by these core wealthy countries and not necessarily distributed back to the peripheral poor countries. So very much like the relationship in domestic politics as well. And they might point to an example of this, of the United States perhaps exploiting poor countries, right? And the United States, of course, United States corporations are constantly looking for cheap labor, and they bounce all around the world, whether it be Vietnam, areas of China, Cambodia, India. Sometimes find the race to the bottom, the cheapest labor they can to produce their goods so they can sell them at a price in the United States and keep that profit. So the Marxists would look at that and say, that's exploitation. That is core countries exploiting the labor of periphery countries. So they would call, Marxists would say that this exploitation of periphery countries is simply advanced imperialism with extra steps, right? And the fundamental flaw, one of the fundamental flaws of capitalism, is it's predicated on growth. It needs a continually growing market. When goods are overproduced, whether it be in America or abroad, and we constantly need more markets to sell and new markets to exploit. Again, this idea of a race to the bottom, find the cheapest goods possible, sell anywhere you can to make that profit. Marxists say that states are not autonomous in themselves. Again, so like constructivism, internal politics play a role in international politics. Those who are controlling the international system in each state are the ruling class, okay? So the struggle between states in the international system is also intrinsically linked to the struggle between the ruling class and the working class internally in states, because the ruling class are controlling international politics and continuing the cycle of exploitation. This is what the Marxists might say. So we're talking about, again, this is in relation to liberalism and realism, specifically liberalism in this case. Liberalists say international institutions promote peace, right? Through connected economies, through connected security agreements, through finding similar ideologies, etc. Marxists do not agree with that, right? Marxists say international institutions are simply a way for stronger countries to take advantage of the poor countries. International institutions are tools, formalized tools for these core, powerful, rich countries to take advantage of the poor periphery developing nations. They also point to war and say war is a tool of the wealthy. Wars are started because of the interest of industry. Wars are a tool to make money, right? Kind of the idea behind the military industrial complex, that you have certain industries in powerful countries whose advantage is for that country to be in war because they can mass produce guns, bullets, bombs, planes, everything. And war is extraordinarily expensive and extraordinarily lucrative for some companies, right? What's the famous saying is, bombs are the perfect product. They're expensive as hell and you only use them once, right? So they really harp on that military industrial complex. Okay, so we talked about Marxism, we talked about the theory, we talked about how Marxists critique realism and liberalism, other international theories. Let's get into the criticism of Marxism because there are many. So historically, Marxism has failed miserably. There has been no real success of Marxism in any large nation in the history of the world. And Marxist economic policies have been so disastrous, it's estimated they killed between 60 and 100 million people in the 20th century alone. And we're not talking about deaths in war, because that's not really fair. We're talking about people starving to death because of poor economic planning. And a lot of that can be attributed to Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao of China, whose economic policies are estimated to kill, I estimate at 45 million. The numbers go from anywhere 30 to 60 million people in 4 years. Right, his Great Leap Forward, which we'll talk about when we talk about China later this semester, basically destroyed their economy, right? And people were starving all over the country. So some might argue that Marxism is constantly defended by the no true Scotsman fallacy. And I'll explain that in a second. I have Willie from The Simpsons here because he's the only Scotsman I could think of. So the biggest defense that you tend to hear of communism is whenever someone says, how can you defend communism? Look at the USSR. It was terrible. People were sent to gulags. People were murdered in their sleep. Millions and millions of people. People starved all over the world. And people say, well, that's not real communism. That's authoritarianism. Well, okay, well, what about China? Chairman Mao killed 40 million people. That's not real communism, right? What about Vietnam? That's not real communism, right? So the problem with that defense is that the world technically, I guess they would say, has never seen real communism. But the problem is real communism, at least till today, is impossible to implement. It always ends up with authoritarianism. And the critique is that because Marxism, communism is such a flawed ideology, it can go no way but authoritarianism. Right? Because basically what communism recommends is an extremely strong state, right? You have this, you go through stages, feudalism, capitalism, and then you have the socialist revolution, and you have an extremely strong state. That state is expected to dissolve itself eventually, and a stateless utopian society is developed. So what's the problem there? Historically, once it gets to that very strong state, those leaders do not want to give up power. Stalin, it was never going to give up power. Mao Zedong was never going to give up power. Over in Cuba, they're never going to give up power, and they never have. So some might point as a criticism of Marxism is it fundamentally misunderstands human nature. Human nature is not to give up power once you've achieved it. These are real people with jobs and salaries. And in communist countries, most people do not belong in the party. It's usually less than 10%, and they are elite. They eat better, they're wealthy. They don't want to give that up. So they have no incentive to dissolve the state into this utopian, classless, stateless society. So attempts at communism never progressed really past authoritarianism. So whenever you hear the critique, oh, that's not real communism. Well, it is real communism because that's how communism always ends up, because it's an extraordinarily flawed theory. It does not work. That would be the critique, right? And I'm not necessarily giving my opinion here. I'm telling you historical examples of why it has failed. And it falls into the no true Scotsman's fallacy. The no true Scotsman's fallacy is essentially, two guys are in a bar. One says, all Scotsmen curse a lot. And like, oh, those aren't true Scotsmen. Scotsmen don't curse. Oh, well, they don't. Those aren't true Scotsmen. Oh, well, they They're rude. Those sound too Trotsky. Basically dismissing anything negative as not true Scotsman. Okay. And you can use it, I don't know why it's called no true Scotsman. You can use it in any country, no true American, right? So if you dismiss any negativity from your theory, it's impossible to disprove, right? And I think that's how a lot of people defend Marxism. And I'm not insulting Scotsmen at all. If you happen to be Scottish, that's just what the fallacy happens to be called. Scottish are a proud and wonderful people, I must say that. So the question is, can communism actually be implemented successfully? And I want to remind you guys, these aren't necessarily my ideas. I'm just giving you prominent critiques of Marxism and communism. So to continue on with critiques, a realist critique, they would state that the state is not a tool of the ruling class. It's complex, it's nuanced, it has a will of its own. So they might say communists or Marxists look at the government, look at the state and say it's just proletariat versus bourgeoisie, but there are nuances, there are complexities. Not every person in power is necessarily wealthy, and vice versa. People go from wealthy to poor and back and forth, they might say. States embody many different institutions that control vast militaries, have substantial resources, right? There's 3 branches of government. There's bureaucrats, there's the military, and they're all kind of competing against each other for resources. Realists might say it's not some big conspiracy, us versus them. It's just kind of almost its own living organic organism. Another critique, of course, one we already spoke about, communism, every attempt essentially leads to authoritarianism, and usually brutal authoritarianism. But we kind of spoke on that, so we can kind of skip that. Another criticism of Marxism is perhaps it leads to lack of incentive, right? So if everything's controlled by the state, there's no competition. Competition is somewhat the backbone of capitalism, right? If you're a car company, if you're Ford, right, and you start producing terrible cars or you can't meet supply, people are going to go buy Toyotas, right, who makes better cars. In a Marxist society, when the government makes all cars, there's no competition. So there's no incentive to pump out more cars or safer cars or faster cars because there's no competition. They have to buy from you. So that could lead to a lack of development and incentive and quality of goods. And perhaps the best example of that is the Soviet Union. It was notorious for producing very poor goods. Some say, especially at the end of the month, they said if you wanted to buy a car or washing machine, first of all, you'd be on a list and you'd be waiting for years. Second of all, you want to get a car made at the beginning of the month, because at the beginning of the month, they're trying to do their best, but at the end of the month, they're trying so hard to meet the quota, they just kind of slap everything together. That's the common criticism. Okay, so that's going to wrap up part B of this lecture. Thank you for tuning in. As always, if you have questions or comments, I'm glad to hear them. Please message me on Canvas, email me, or set up a time in office hours, and have a wonderful day.